Ever since Brotherhood came out in 2009, people just would not shut up about it. Obviously, there is a lot of praise for the show, and while I don't think it's entirely undeserved, I never really see anyone praising O3 in the same way. In fact, I think O3 has practically fallen into the point of obscurity. This seems unfair to me, as pretty much any attempt to show some appreciation for the first adaptation is almost always undercut by fans saying that Brotherhood is just straight up better. That is why I am here to strongly declare that not only is FMA 2003 underrated, but also that it is actually a masterpiece. Right off the bat, I think it's fair to say that O3 has a very strong sense of tone and direction in conveying its ideas. When it comes to major story beats like Nina transforming into a chimera or Maze Hughes' death, the strong use of lighting and music allows for stronger sentimental impact. When it picks an emotion to focus on, it goes all out in trying to evoke that feeling in the audience. This also plays a big role in why these characters have some of the most beloved faces and personalities ever established in fiction. Without these powerful scenes, the characters would just be another NPC in the story. Sometimes this doesn't really work, like with Al and his sudden existential crisis, but when it hits really hard. By comparison, it takes a much longer time to get invested in the world for Brotherhood, at least for me, because... Okay, before I continue, I know that the common defense for the beginning of Brotherhood is that the producers were rushing through this part of the story so that they could get to the part that wasn't covered by the original, but A, that's a terrible reason because any adaptation should work to improve or at least meet the same quality as its source material, and B, speeding through this part of the narrative makes it actively harder to empathize with anything that's going on. I mean, the opening act is one of the most vital parts of any type of storytelling. When done correctly, you can hook your audience and make them genuinely interested in what's in store for the future. Watching the first 13 or so episodes of Brotherhood, I can't ever imagine myself enjoying anything within this portion of the anime without having any outside knowledge of the source material. Without the context provided in other forms of this story, I would not be able to get attached to any of the characters, let alone events that happen, at least for a long time. In comparison, O3 handles this extremely well, dedicating several episodes to Ed and Al's origin, giving the viewers a better feel for the characters and the motivations behind their actions. It also does a fantastic job at introducing the supporting cast, identities who were essentially non-entities in Brotherhood, and above all else, the homunculi are infinitely more layered than in either the manga or Brotherhood. I was pleasantly surprised by how much I enjoyed Les's character arc. By giving her the motivation to become human, she immediately becomes more sympathetic, and her writers do some really great things with her. Her interactions with Scar and Ed are some of my favorite pieces of dialogue in the show. Sloth and Wrath are no slouches either, though Wrath does tend to annoy a lot of people. But the anime still does interesting things with him, and his relationship with Ed and Sloth makes for a pretty cool segment in the later parts of the story. Also, by changing the origin of the homunculi, the writers managed to make the villains more thematically relevant. Since a homunculus is the result of a failed human transmutation in this version, it only adds to the tragedy of the main cast. Wrath and Sloth are directly referred to as the sins of Izumi and Ed respectively. Envy, being the son of Hohenheim, makes for inevitable turmoil for the two main characters, and Lust's deep history related to Scar progresses his more layered personality in this version. O3 is directed very competently as well, in terms of both action and emotional depth. In particular, I want to draw attention to the fight between Ed and Barry the Chopper, which was directed in such a way that really drove home the sense of helplessness and desperation that Ed was feeling. This fight plays a bigger role in the story than you would expect, drawing a connection from the failed human transmutation shown at the beginning to the Nina incident to, of course, Barry the Chopper. O3 is primarily a story about growth and maturity, and one of the first chain of events that Ed goes through sets this theme into motion all the way until the end of the story. It first started with Ed developing a close relationship with Nina, and to a lesser extent Shao Tucker, essentially starting a second family with the two of them. And when the heart-wrenching conclusion to this story finally hits the screen, Ed is crushed to see that he is absolutely powerless to help, and that he has such little control over the situation. Tie that back to what I said about how the fight scene between Ed and Barry was directed, and you'll see an instant connection. At the beginning of the story, we're introduced to Ed as a child prodigy who's a bit on the cocky side.
There's still something missing, something scientists haven't been able to find in centuries of research. So what makes you think that hackjob priest with his parlor tricks is gonna be able to? We're the closest things to gods there are.
And once he becomes a state alchemist, he immediately finds out how little he is in the grand scheme of things.
You know, I was picturing a more poignant ceremony, trumpets or something.
Sure, Edward. Congrats, you're a dog of the military now.
The first person he meets from Central is Mustang, who manipulates his every move and has someone keep an eye on him at all times. Almost right after passing the exam, Ed hands in his pocket watch and decides to quit because he hated the idea that someone else was controlling him. It was after seeing how truly defenseless he was that he decided to swallow his pride and pursue the things that actually mattered, restoring his brother's body, because in their situation, all they've got is each other. In the short episode count, Ed already goes through a substantial amount of growth, which doesn't feel rushed or forced in the slightest, and he doesn't just stop there. He runs into so many obstacles that make him face reality and realize that his initial perception of the world is flawed. Which leads me to the ending. The oh so infamous ending. The ending that, I quote, came out of nowhere and made absolutely no sense at all. This is completely bullshit. The ending is a perfect encapsulation of the journey that the Elric brothers went on. This is the moment where Ed lets go of all of his childish perceptions of the world and finally completes his growth. I love this scene so much because up until this point, the law of equivalent exchange is always driven into your mind. All of the beginning episodes had a segment dedicated to explaining the fundamental law of alchemy. So when Ed performs his last transmutation, he subconsciously lets go of his stubborn ideologies in order to finally get Al's body back as a 10-year-old without any of the memories of their quest for the Philosopher's Stone. This allowed Al to fully be unburdened, forgetting about the doubts that he had in the show up until this point. All of this came at the price of seemingly nothing, thus shattering the flawed concept of equivalent exchange and making his character arc come full circle. But a finale is nothing without the build-up, which leads me into my final and most important point in why FMA 2003 is actually freaking brilliant. Its phenomenal use of filler. No, this isn't a joke. From the start, the writers for O3 knew that they wanted to take the story in a completely different direction than in the manga. This is why they changed the order of a lot of the events in the story. During the first half of the show, they sprinkled in large bits of foreshadowing which would push the story forward and make the transition into the second half less jarring. Most of this is done in filler episodes, so instead of these episodes just being a waste of time, they become some pretty entertaining self-contained stories that end up having lasting effects on the plot. This means that no matter how pointless an episode may seem, it actually does more to keep both your attention and foreshadow events in the climax. And what a climax it was! Carrying some of the most memorable character moments and events that are just straight up mind-blowing. The interactions between Sloth, Ed, and Al near the end were genuinely some of the most sad and emotionally crippling things I have ever seen. Seeing as how the homunculized memories are real, Sloth's last words about succumbing to these memories and actually developing protective feelings for the boys cuts really deep. Scar's plan to draw a huge transmutation circle around a town to lure the military into a false sense of security and then transforming them into a Philosopher's Stone was so fucking awesome and full of tension, and him learning from the Elric brothers and atoning for all of his sins by doing for Al what his brother had done for him was touching and satisfying to watch. Learning about Mustang's motivations for climbing the social hierarchy in the military was a really strong defining moment for him, and his last bits of interactions with Ed are a perfect capping point for his progression. Everything with Lust, just everything that they did with her character was absolutely incredible. Her wanting to become human and eventually teaming up with Ed to save Al was moving and believable, and her death filled you with a sense of relief, and in a way it was tragic with her not being able to accomplish her goals. The way that literally everything feels like it just comes together at the end, where almost every minor character comes back to fulfill the roles that they were meant to. Just everything that O3 did with Shao Tucker, the way that Greed died teaching Ed about the homunculi and what their weakness was, everything is just so tightly written and directed in a way that sends multiple bits of information towards you, and it feels so rewarding when you finally make it to the end. At the end of the day, this anime deserves way more credit than it has right now. My intention with this video is not to say which version is better, I just wanted to give O3 the attention that it deserves. It's extremely well made, the writing is phenomenal, and it takes full advantage of its format in order to tell the best standalone story that it could.